Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon, Professor.
Okay, are there any questions before we start? Anyone has any questions regarding anything?
I have one about the presentation.
Mm-hmm.
On the document that has the questions on it, at least for question number 2, I know I asked this last class at the end, but I feel like there's not too terribly much to go off of in terms of what you want us to talk about in the missing links of the reform, for the economic reform. I was thinking that it would be structured like the Ataturk model, some of its applications in different countries, and then another slide for the treaties and such of the region. But I just feel like I don't have enough, the number of slides.
Well,
So I feel like the slides themselves are dense.
yeah, what you need to do there is probably do some research on your own regarding the MENA region and show why the MENA region, in fact, we talked about this, but you can, get more information regarding maybe numbers, dates, whatever. Why has the MENA region failed to make the necessary steps or to take the necessary steps towards reforms or structural adjustments? What were the main reasons? And I guess we talked about them. There's several reasons why. So those are the missing links in as far as the structural adjustments are concerned in the MENA region, and why it took so long for the MENA region to actually get on board in as far as the structural transformation is concerned. So there is plenty there is plenty of data actually that you can find. If you Google that, you will find a lot of sources that, excuse me, go over the reasons why the MENA region did not do so well in embarking on such a strategy, economic reforms. So it has political, it has economic connotations, social connotations, all attached to that. And I guess, we pretty much talked about a lot of those. So even if you go back to the recordings or of the lecture that we had, the past 2 or 3 sittings, you will see that I talked extensively about the reasons why countries were not able to embark on such a strategy, or at least it took them some time to realize that that was pretty much the way out for them.
All right. Thank you very much. I have a lot more to go off of now.
No problem. Any other question? Okay, today what we want to do is we want to start a new chapter, which is chapter 9. It's the effects of oil on Development and the Rise of the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC. So we pretty much want to focus here on oil revenues, basically. How were oil revenues used in the MENA region to exacerbate, if you will, the notion of economic development, or to pretty much strengthen economic development as a result of all of these um, government revenues that started to flow in. Um, how did it, in fact, impact development, the social, political, economic, and so on? So this is basically what we want to focus on, and we want to look at both the resource-rich, labor-poor, and resource-rich, labor abundant, and the resource poor, labor abundant. We want to look at the strategies that were used. Now, you may say, well, why do we want to concern ourselves with the resource poor, labor abundant, since they didn't have any oil and they weren't producing any oil, so they weren't getting any huge government revenues come in? Why do we need to talk about them? They really have nothing to do with the oil revenues. And the answer to that question is yes, they do. And the reason is simply because for the resource poor, labor abundant countries, they have a lot of the people working in the resource rich, labor poor, and labor abundant countries. Um, and as a result, the oil revenues will impact them directly. The more oil revenues these countries are getting, the more they will be hiring. So you will see a lot of people migrating from countries such as Yemen, for example, Lebanon, Syria, Sudan, Morocco, to the countries that are actually producing oil. So it really does have an impact on them. And we will look at those remittances and how those remittances were used in the development process for a lot of these countries. We will also look at the Dutch disease. What is the Dutch disease and how it has affected the MENA region, particularly the Arab countries and Iran. So the Dutch disease had huge impact in these countries, and we will explain how it affected the development strategies for the countries concerned. Sometimes, we refer to that as the oil curse, basically. So we will look at the negative impacts of the oil curse for a lot of these countries in the region, especially when it comes to diversification. We will also look at a very important concept in the MENA region. I guess my internet is showing some instability, so probably I'm cutting off maybe. But anyway, we will also look at an important phenomenon in the MENA region that results from the understanding of the exchange rate. The exchange rate also plays an extremely important role in how the economy is diversified and also the development strategies. And we will talk about that later on. So we will talk in terms of tradable goods versus non-tradable goods. That's basically the definition of exchange rate from a microeconomic point of view, which is much more important than the macro definition of exchange rates, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, at least those who have taken international economics. We pretty much define the exchange rate in macroeconomic terms. In other words, it is simply defined as the price of one currency in terms of another. That's the macroeconomic definition of exchange rates. But in our case, of course, we will be more interested in the micro economic definition of exchange rate, which is usually defined as the ratio of tradables versus non-tradables. We will talk about that today. So this is basically, what we want to talk about, and we will also talk about what are some of the strategies used by these countries to actually overcome the Dutch disease or the oil curse. What type of avenues are open for these countries that can actually use to mitigate the Dutch disease phenomenon? And we will look at the GCC, for example, and they pretty much had a very, very smart way to address the Dutch disease. And we will talk about that extensively later on, if not today, maybe in the next session. So this is basically all that we want to say about this chapter. Basically, we want to focus on the effect of oil on development in the MENA region. Now, obviously, as we all know, oil pretty much has changed the landscape of all the countries in the MENA region. In other words, sometimes people say, well, they refer to oil as an oil curse, but I can't imagine, for example, if oil was not found in that region, what would have happened to that region in terms of development, basically. Now, some have said that it would have been better if these countries never discovered oil. Their economies would be much, much better off today than if oil was discovered. So, in fact, they pretty much uh, espouse or agree with the oil curse theory. But in my view, I think that's taking it too far. I think that oil has pretty much positively impacted a lot of these countries. And we can see basically what these countries have done. In other words, how they were able to transform from pretty much isolated rural desert type of countries to metropolis, to huge cities with um, skyrise buildings, etc. Uh, and I guess, the author here basically on page 519, I believe, or is it 319? I can't see those numbers. They're very small, in fact. Uh, yeah, I think it's 519. Well, let's see what the author says here. Um, and he says that as historian Roger Owen in 2008 reminds us, the story about the place of oil in the region can be told in many different ways, depending on one's point of view. So the triumphalist story of oil, irrigating development, for example, focuses on the monopolies or on the, I'm sorry, metropolies emerging in the deserts of the Emirates. I'm sorry, the writing is so small and I can't see it, but I'll do my best here. This is also the story of oil interests exploiting local populations and disrupting their traditional way of life. So there is a positive and there is a negative. And the nationalist story, of course, of OPEC leaders, including Mossadegh, Gaddafi, and Saddam, is one of confronting major oil companies, telling them to pay more for oil, and ultimately nationalizing said companies. So, a popular story is the narrative of Western powers supporting the Arab autocrats. This is another negative of oil, supporting the Arab autocrats in order to defend the West's oil interests in the region. All these stories have some elements of truth, and the contradictions they contain reveal the complexity of the oil phenomenon in the region. So you can see, as I was saying before, that yes, it has pluses and it has minuses, but in as far as I know, and from the data that we see, and from the realities of all of these economies in the MENA region, we see that oil has more pluses than minuses. And this is basically what we want to do today. We want to pretty much talk about that in much more details. And let's go back to, actually, I prepared some notes here. Let's just hmm, sorry.